we've seen this before. Every winter, snow comes, it gets cold, Russia masses troops on the border, and then spring comes and the Russian threat subsides. This year obviously was different because Putin had made a decision for various reasons that he wanted to go in, and I think as history goes on, we'll know more of those reasons. Maybe there's a health reason for that. Maybe it's simply about his legacy. Maybe it's about the next presidential election in Russia. But he has his reasons for going in, and we'll learn those later. But as an expat who's been in Ukraine 23 years, my intention was to stay as long as possible. I had no intention to leave Kyiv, but the realities on the ground change. During the Orange Revolution, during Euromaidan, I was in Ukraine the entire time. I was on the Maidan. I was taking part in these things, and I would just point out too. When it's Ukrainians against, Ukrainian law enforcement standing there and protesting, that's courageous, and that was what happened during the Maidans. But when it's, Ukrainians standing against a foreign army which is armed to the teeth, that's not smart. Simply, it's just not. It's one of those things that. You have to use common sense. The key for me, which made me leave Kyiv, was on February 11th, the evening. It was a Friday evening, and I got a call from a friend at the embassy, and he said, "I just want you to know we're shredding documents at the embassy now," and I think you know what that means. And so, in U.S. State Department protocol, when an embassy's shredding documents, there's nothing good that's coming from this. This harkens back for Americans to Tehran, 1980, and the fall of the Shah, and the invasion of the embassy. So when that happened, that was a wake-up call. The next day, the U.S. Embassy destroyed tens of millions of dollars of signals and communications equipment, just to make sure that the Russians could not get their hands on it. And then that Sunday, February 13th, they had a Hercules aircraft take the embassy staff to Crete and then on to the U.S. So as those events were happening, I decided that the best thing for me to do, given that the remaining embassy staff will be moving to Lviv, is I drove my car to Lviv, took 2 weeks to close on February 13th. However, the situation in Lviv was a temporary stop because the overall situation continued to deteriorate. As everyone now knows, within a few days, the British ambassador, who had been designated by the G7 and the Five Eyes countries, she even came back from Kyiv to Lviv. So when the one ambassador designated to stand behind, came on to Lviv, that was a sign that things are not going well at all. And then, of course, we know on February 24th what had happened. I made a determination to go into Poland, so I left for Poland about a day before the war. Went to Przemyśl and then on to Warsaw, and I was there when the war started. Those first few days were horrible in so many ways because you couldn't sleep, even though you were tired. You get 2-3 hours sleep at the most, but then you'd want to wake up because you would be worried about somebody or something, and where are they? Are they safe? Or your phone's ringing, and it was just one of those. I'd say the first 2 weeks was just a complete blur of phone calls, trying to help, working yourself to exhaustion, falling asleep at your desk, and then waking up a couple hours later and doing it all again. Drank a lot of coffee. Somehow we got through it. But once we saw that Ukraine was not going to fall, and Ukraine had tremendous will to fight to defend their homeland, that made a huge difference because it gave everyone hope. We started to see that there is going to be a tomorrow, and that inspired the world. I mean, the entire world now. You see this ad campaign, "Be brave like Ukraine." I was in Washington last week at Union Station and saw a big billboard like that. So Ukraine has certainly inspired the world, and that is encouraging, I think, for everyone. You know, when this war started out, Vladimir Putin said he wanted regime change in Ukraine. And I do believe that there will be regime change before all this is over, but the regime change will be in Russia, not in Ukraine. So, you know, some things are still functioning quite well, like banking services. And why is that? Because in early January, the National Bank and Privat Bank and a lot of the big banks moved all their servers either to Lviv or to Poland. So you have a very, I'd say, pretty well functioning financial system. Yes, there's inflation. The official rate's 29 to 5 of the hryvnia to the dollar. The street rate's about 33. But if you figure the hryvnia has only lost 10 to 20% of its value in wartime against a nuclear power, that's not bad. That's a pretty good achievement, I would say. You know, the commerce is still taking place. It's much reduced. Ukraine got its, you know, seed sown for the next harvest. That was there's a lot of things going on that, you know, where you see, you know, business continuing to find a way to go forward. I know in my personal business in public relations, government relations, you know, we probably had, say, 10 clients at the start of the war. We have 3 that are paying right now. Now, when the war is over at some point, I'm sure we'll get those clients back and so forth. Credit to the three companies that are continuing to pay, though, because we just have an agreement. You know, you're not going to get much work out of us right now, but later you'll get that work back. So one of those companies is a Canadian company. So thank you, Canada. And so we're proud of that as well. But that allows me as a small businessman to pay my employees every month because even during wartime, people have to earn a living. You still got to eat. You still got to pay the rent. You still got to pay the utilities, put food on the table. So that is, you know, I'd say a blessing that we've been able to experience with those clients. Obviously, we're not getting a lot of work done on my side of things. That's why, for the most part, we've shifted entirely to humanitarian work. And so when the war came, I gave the staff a choice. I said, you know, we can do nothing or we can do humanitarian work and try to get medical and humanitarian aid into Ukraine. And of course, they all unanimously, you know, wanted to be a part of that. So we set up an organization, Help Ukraine 22, which is administered by the Committee for Open Democracy, a U.S.A 1C3 that I've been the director of for many years, which has historically been, you know, election observation in Ukraine to humanitarian aid because it was within our scope, our mission statement. But obviously, there's not going to be any elections in Ukraine if Russia wins the war. So it made sense for us to switch all of our operations to humanitarian and medical aid. Necessity is the mother of invention. And so, look, I have some charity background, I have some business background, business contacts, obviously. So we put those to use. I reached out to, you know, former government friends, former friends in the military with, you know, good logistical supply chain experience. You know, so we put together a group of about 30 volunteers. They're either working on humanitarian aid or they're driving supplies. You know, they're preparing documents for shipments. A lot of the women who work for me are outside the country right now, but they're doing what they can, whether that's, you know, promoting the work we're doing on social media, designing a website that people can go to and apply for grants for humanitarian aid. All those things are important. In wartime, the only person who has time to plan is the aggressor. So, you know, we were all on the defensive. We had to, you know, create something from nothing. And we managed to do that with a lot of difficulty. In the case of Help Ukraine 22, we built the airplane at 30,000 feet. We were nailing on the wing as we were flying. But, you know, to date, we've supported 70 different projects, which have reached about 170,000 Ukrainians. We've provided and delivered $1.25 million worth of aid, medical and humanitarian, to Ukrainians in need. So we're proud of that. You know, we've raised a good deal of money. We're still, you know, doing this work month to month, and we anticipate, you know, we're going to be doing this through the end of summer at least, if not longer. And this ranges from everything from, rescue, relief, and resupply of humanitarian medical goods, relief in terms of supporting medical institutions and NGOs doing real work to provide shelter, for IDPs and others. And we've done help to, cover the cost of some evacuations and arrange some evacuations of Ukrainians who were in, dangerous places, particularly in the early days of the war. We are on a daily basis trying to secure tourniquets, first aid kits, certain medical supplies. And, normally this would be done by somebody who's been in the business for 20 years. And so we've been reaching out, directly to suppliers. We've been reaching out to, doctors' offices. And we have some surgical equipment being donated by a doctor out of the Boston area, and we're able to, the equipment's donated, we're paying the transport, getting it to Poland, and then we're going to drive it down into Ukraine and then distribute it. So wartime, you learn to move much faster and maybe more efficiently than you would otherwise. Thankfully, I want to say that Ukraine has dropped a lot of the bureaucratic hurdles. I mean, it's as simple as, there used to be a 5% tax on folks, that's people who are entrepreneurs, and that has been taken down to 2% for the war. So basically, you got a 2% flat tax on everything, so that people receiving money from relatives abroad or friends, they're not gonna have to worry about the taxes later, because so it's a very practical change. Even crossing the border from Ukraine and Poland, compliments, big kudos to Poland and compliments to the Ukrainian Border Service for making those border crossings much easier. I've crossed Ukrainian borders for years in cars, and it is an ordeal. But for the most part, the last couple months, the border crossings have become much more efficient, much more effective. Of course, there's some delays because Ukraine also abolished the tax on registration of cars that are registered in Ukraine. So a lot of cars are being brought from Europe in. So Easter weekend, there was a huge line, actually about a 13-mile line that I counted at the Medica border and near Shimish, because I was coming back in at that point. But, there's some bumps along the way, but for the most part, the bureaucracy has been less bureaucratic. They've been much more practical. People are helping each other in a way. They're much more understanding than before. The organization is Help Ukraine 22, www.hu22.org. The estimates are that Ukraine's GDP will be cut in half this year. And so for a country that was coming out of COVID, looking at about a 3% GDP rate, that's going to be 1.5. I mean, thank God, at least it's got, maybe 1.5% growth. And of course, that can change depending on how long the war goes. Job-wise, we know that, 5 Ukrainians have been refugees, another 8.5 million are internally displaced. You do quick math, that's 14 million people out of 41 million. That's a third of the population. Now, of course, it's going to break heavily towards, children, towards the elderly, maybe people that are not as involved in the workforce as others. But, if you look at the male population, of course, you have so many men that have enlisted and joined the army. We won't know the full effect of how many jobs have been lost. The only good thing about COVID was it did teach everyone to work remotely. I know I'm a small businessman, but in the weeks leading up to the war, I told the staff repeatedly, work from home. You don't need to come to the office. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a good time to go to Western Ukraine. Those are messages I continually reinforce to the staff. They didn't really listen very well, which I guess is a credit in some ways. But people are used to working remotely. So those who can work remotely, whether it's, say, the IT sector, they can probably get by and continue, not too badly affected by the war. The key components, though, in the economy, though, are agriculture, 100%. Ukraine is one of the few countries, just a handful of countries in the world, that is protein self-sufficient. So the world depends on Ukraine for agriculture. And, the last estimate I saw, this was probably early March, they expected Ukraine's agricultural exports to be 15% of what they were last year. So that's going to have an effect, and it already is having an effect in the world economy, on food supplies, supply chains, all these kind of things. That was the numbers I heard from an official in the Zelensky administration in early March. I mean, and you got to figure, okay, exports are down because more food has to be used internally, to feed people. So we're going to have less excess to export. At the same time, though, Russia's goal is to take Odessa and to close off the Black Sea, the southern corridor for Ukraine, simply because that, you can't be a great agricultural exporter if you don't have access to the sea. And that's just fundamental. Mariupol was 1/3 of Ukraine's exports. The Odessa port is about 2/3. So that is the, that gives you some indication of how important that is. Right now, Odessa, it's not conquered. The Odessa people have stood up to the Russian tyranny, which is encouraging. I think there was some concerns over, which way Odessa would go if the Russian army came in. And I think the concern, based upon information and belief, the concerns were legitimate. However, as usual, Russia overplayed its hand. They learned something about Odessa that Ukrainians and Odessites have known for a long time. Odessa, they may take your money, but it doesn't mean they're going to do what you tell them. These boycotts on Russia, as well as the sanctions, are going to be in place for a while. It's not like suddenly, Russia comes to June the 1st and like, hey, we're sorry, guys. Okay, let's all go back to, doing business as usual. No, those products are going to be off the market for a while. And, the products that have not been sanctioned are largely going to be boycotted. So that creates a vacuum, that creates openings for Ukrainian products, it creates openings for European, Polish, American products, and so forth, Canadian products. So we're entering a new world in terms of, Russian products being off the market and a need for someone else to fill that void. And hopefully Ukraine will be a key part of that. If somebody was tempted to take 5 or 10 or 20% of some humanitarian aid before, that is, I think at least in initial days, that went to zero. So people would pass everything directly where it needed to go. I think, over time, there will be inevitably, some sticky fingers, but that's anywhere. That's any humanitarian crisis, anywhere in the world, from the dawn of civilization till now. But for the most part, there's a unity, people helping each other and, putting the country ahead of themselves. So far, it's been estimated Ukraine has received about $50 billion worth of aid, from the private sector, largely from governments. So that's 1/3 of the Ukrainian GDP, pre-war GDP. And that's going to continue. It's going to be even more because a lot of the organizations like the United Nations, for example, once there's a ceasefire, they're going to pour their billions in. Right now, they're kind of sitting on the sidelines. They're doing stuff with refugees and across the border. But inside Ukraine, that money has not been, unleashed yet. So there's going to be even more aid coming in. There's always a temptation for corruption, but this is something Ukraine has not experienced in anyone's lifetime currently living. World War II was also horrific, but this is the largest troop movement in Europe since 1945. So there is a general sense of unity. People, if they pinch, a little bit off the humanitarian side, it's a pinch and it's not a handful. Look, if Ukraine is going to solve the corruption issue, now is the time. And Zelensky has, rightly so, earned his popularity, and he has the ability now to once and for all, one fell swoop, stop the corruption. So you've got, a 2% tax on earnings right now, which is down from 5%. Maybe that goes up to 3% going forward, but it's strictly enforced, right? So if you get 3% of something, that's better than 0% of billions, right? So there's an opportunity for Zelensky to make sweeping reforms which would transform Ukraine's image of having been hamstrung by corruption all these years. You can transform it into a modern economy that is IT, driven, and that was Zelensky's one of his campaign campaign promises. We're going to put the country in a smartphone, right? And now he has that opportunity, and by putting in a smartphone where everything is transparent, is procured in a public manner, you can eliminate a huge amount of corruption. I mean, Prozor was, anti-corruption 1.0 to compare to, where Zelensky can take the country right now in terms of fighting corruption and get it to 2.0, 4.0, 5.0. Now, there's got to be political will. But I do believe after all this that Ukraine has the political will to make these changes. I think the public's going to demand it. When you lose so many people, and we don't even know exactly how many Ukrainians have died. There's an estimate of 25,000 just in Mariupol. And I would think that the larger number is probably closer to 50,000 if you count the soldiers, the losses in the Donbass now. We just don't know we won't know till later. You can't lose 50,000 people in a country the size of Ukraine. 50,000, by the way, was what the U.S. lost in Vietnam over 20 years. So you can't lose that many people that quickly without having an effect on society, and people saying like, no more from now on. These people have not died in vain, but we're going to build a modern European country that is going to be the pride of Europe. I would just add one anecdotal story. That February 24th, when the war broke out, one of the members of my staff, my senior Ukrainian staffer, he was born in Lviv, lives in Kyiv many years. He went to the conscription office to enlist. And when he got there, and he was there probably by 9 o'clock in the morning, there was already a huge line of about 100 people outside the doorway. As he was walking towards the end of the line, he noticed about half the guys probably had some military experience before. The other half were, barbers and chefs and taxi drivers and so forth. And he said for him, the key moment when he knew Ukraine was going to fight and have a real chance to not only defend itself, but to win this war. As he was waiting in line, a Glovo driver, Glovo, of course, is the food delivery service. And these guys have these big backpacks that have food, and they deliver them around. And there was a Glovo driver on a moped, and he drove up. Everyone assumed he was delivering food into the conscription office. Instead, he took his backpack off, put it on the moped, and he got in line to sign up. So if you think about it, if you have the equivalent of a Domino's pizza delivery guy enlisting to fight for his country, then you know that that country is going to survive and prosper eventually, because that's a huge investment in the future of Ukraine.